light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I wanted to offer a few thoughts and reflections on what I have decided to call the pitfalls of popularity, the problems that could result from an obsession or a preoccupation with being popular. Going through high school, it seemed like popularity was the one thing most sought after by virtually everyone. And yet, perhaps because I was autistic, even though I didn't know it at the time, the whole notion of popularity never made any sense to me and consequently wasn't particularly high on my list. I did what had truth and integrity for me, what seemed most authentic, what had the least duplicity, the least two-facedness to it, where, if what you say isn't who you are, or what you say isn't what you mean, if something was somehow presenting itself one way and being a total different way, and I was able to discern that, those are all examples of duplicity, which my autistic mind wanted things to be congruent and consistent and uniform. And why would you want to do anything other than tell the truth? One of the most basic problems of popularity is that it ties into fashions and trends and continually evolving human society. And the notion some people put forth of wanting to always be very fashion conscious and always have the latest fashions. And one of the problems with that, though, is that the fashions change so fast and so regularly. Every year there's discussion about, quote, this year's colors, as if the fashion colors for the particular have to change every single year. The problem in my experience with that is that my clothes don't wear out that fast. If I have to wear only the clothes that are always in fashion, I'll be spending exorbitant amounts on new clothes all the time, because I always have to have the latest fashions, and I'll have all these clothes that haven't worn out. And, well, I guess they go to the thrift stores and are sold to poor people at discounted prices and so forth. So I've heard some people actually justify this whole continual pursuit of being in fashion as a sort of source for goods that are not worn out to be donated to thrift stores, so that thrift stores will always have inventory, because there's always wealthier people who are trying to be constantly fashion conscious and throwing out clothes that are not worn out yet simply because they're out of fashion. It seems to be this ridiculous gerbil wheel of wealth spinning in this direction and funneling goods through this whole economic system, in a sense getting various things to the poor people more quickly, but in another sense basically creating this, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that the fashion-conscious people are buying the newest, latest, and greatest, and the only thing the poor people can afford are last year's fashions, or the year before, or however many years. So that it's as if we are building into this economic commercial system a way of making sure that the poor are always not in fashion and the wealthy are always in fashion. And going back to earlier times in human history, clothing and housing and such were not about fashion so much as practicality. Houses were built out of what was available. Houses that were built in regions that were very rocky were built out of stone. Houses that were built in areas where there were lots of trees were built out of wood. Houses that had to be built on the Great Plains during the frontier days were built out of sod, because that was the material that was available. I recall reading someplace that the reason the houses in Japan were built out of rice paper is because they had so many tsunamis and earthquakes and other environmental disasters that if they built their houses out of rice paper, no one would be killed if the house fell down on top of them. And I don't know if that's entirely true, but that was the report I heard. And I guess it makes sense. There was a way that by having multiple panels of rice paper and such, they were able to create sufficient concentrations of heat that they could survive cold winter months. But there was a pragmatic reason for a lot of it. And then we started getting into the human peculiar choices of governments and fashion and so forth. From one anthropological perspective, it's possible fashions are about attracting the very best mate. I suppose that's one explanation for it, but it would depend entirely on what sort of values that mate would have. If you're looking for someone who's wealthy and they simply want what's beautiful, that's one thing. But if you're wanting a mate who is able to deal with the challenges of life as they occur, able to build and invent things, what's most beautiful probably won't be the top criteria. What that person would be looking for in a mate would be someone who was somehow able to support this process of being able to relocate and rebuild as often as necessary, or to go through changes more effectively, to deal with the common central core of tasks and duties of keeping up a household, whether it's cooking or cleaning or whatever, that the partnership of those two would hopefully have love at somewhere near the center of it, but would also have this kind of symbiotic I'll help you and you help me sort of thing going on. But there were a number of styles of architecture, for example, that were created specifically in response to peculiar tax laws created by certain regional governments. If I remember the terms correctly, there's a particular kind of roof, I think it was called a mansard roof. In any case, it's whatever its name is, it's the particular kind of roof where the roofing shingles and tar paper extends down to just above the first floor, and there's kind of so it's very steep roof sides, kind of flattish on top, but very steep sides, and then the rain gutter is right above the first floor, so that everything inside the roof is considered the attic. The reason I'm told that that style of roof was created is because attics weren't taxed. So if you had a 2-story house, but you extended the roof down to just above the first floor, you now had, instead of a 2-story house, you had a 1-story house with a really big attic, but it was only taxed as a 1-story house. Totally impractical reason, but there are all sorts of quirks like that that were created specifically not because of any environmental imperative, but because of some peculiar governmental decision that really was just somebody's decision. It had no reason for being that way. Another style of housing had the barns built on the ground floor and the house built above it. There are all sorts of different environmental things that influence that, but when it comes to the pitfalls of popularity, you're dealing more with the non-environmental social imperatives. You do something because of everyone else's approval. Problem with living for everyone else's approval is you never get around to living your own life. You may do what someone else has dreamed for you, but that someone else doesn't know what your aptitudes are, what your passions are, what your hopes and dreams are, how you feel about things. It's as if someone else is trying to be the director of your life, in which you're the only one who has to pay all the consequences for what happened. To me, it seems there is something horribly unjust and absolutely wrong about someone else directing all the action without having to bear any of the consequences. If they make a mistake, oh well, it's gone. It's one of my primary complaints, actually, with the American medical system, that doctors can be absolutely 100% wrong, the person can die, and still there is this bill for thousands upon thousands of dollars that is extracted from the person's estate to pay the medical bills, to pay the doctor even though the doctor was completely wrong. Essentially, the doctor has no stake in whether or not they're right. They lose nothing, absolutely nothing, if the prescription they write, if the treatment plan they give, if any of it totally fails. It's a profession that currently in America has no accountability. If I went to have my car repaired at a particular auto mechanic shop and I got it back, and within 5 minutes of driving away it still wasn't fixed, I could go back and say, you didn't really do the work, give me my money back. If I buy a product from a store that turns out to be defective, I can take it back and get my money back. If I go to a doctor and say, your prescription didn't work, I get nothing. The problem, the additional problem with that, getting back to the pitfalls of popularity, is that when the medical establishment or the professional collection of doctors decides that this or that treatment is the most recommended treatment, this is what everybody should do because we're the knowledgeable people and we say it should happen. It's the popularity of a particular idea. But the pitfall of that is that that popular idea may in fact be completely wrong. It's well known that George Washington, the first president of the United States, died because he was simply bled too much. At the time that he lived, doctors considered bleeding to be one of, to be a sound and recommendable medical practice, that you let out the bad blood and the body rejuvenates with good blood and heals itself. Well, they bled him so many times he died. That was the popular medical practice of the day. At one point in time, the response to people who had emotional difficulties was to perform a lobotomy. And it was thankfully not too long before it was decided instead that this briefly popular medical treatment was in fact quite unsound and should not be done anymore. Additionally, I was told that the real reason lobotomies ceased to be performed is that there was a particular pharmaceutical company that came up with a drug that would accomplish the same effect. And so it was described as the chemical lobotomy instead of doing a physical one. But these are things that were popular, that, within certain circles, that people wanted an answer and a popular answer was provided. And in retrospect, we would say these were absolutely wrong answers. And it's not like the medical profession is the only one about which you can say that. This has been true in building professions and legal professions, in virtually every profession. Things that were regarded, well, even in agriculture, the notion of plowing up the Great Plains and turning everything into tillable farm soil. And of course that led right to the Great Dust Bowl and one of the biggest environmental disasters that the United States has experienced. The pitfalls of popularity. When somebody says, here is the answer, let's all grab it. And we stop and we fail to consider, we fail to stop and recognize that an answer that works very well in one place won't necessarily work anywhere else. That the reason an answer works in one place is because there are specific things about that place that make that answer appropriate to that context. If it's the correct answer, I suggest that the more you study it, the more convinced you'll become. And if it's the incorrect answer, I suggest that the more you study it, the more you'll find it just doesn't add up. That it may have worked once, it may have worked 30% of the time even, but it doesn't work often enough to know that it's the right answer for yourself. Coming back to where we started, in a sense, in dealing with the pitfalls of popularity, it's all oriented about other people's approval and opinions. Whether or not the face in the mirror, looking at yourself, whether you actually approve of yourself, or whether you are so living for someone else that you are not allowed to be honest about your own struggles, your own psychological and emotional pain, the ways that your life is feeling so empty and unfulfilled. And there are a lot of situations in which people have felt so enslaved to a pursuit of popularity that they wind up committing suicide because they haven't given themselves even a square foot of space to stand on and simply be themselves. Should we avoid being popular? Again, that's putting effort into something instead of just working on your own integrity, your own creative expression. It's not that we try not to be popular because it's so bad. It's not that we try to be popular because everyone, at least we'll have everybody applauding us for a short time at least. As with most things, I think, the answer usually lies somewhere between the extremes. Instead of having none or all, to simply say, to acknowledge, and yes, it is frustrating, but it seems to me life is always a mixed bag. There's always some good effects and some bad effects, and because it's different good and bad effects in each different situation, it only makes sense that the one who has to live with the consequences be the one to make the choice. In some cases, of course, here we get into parenting situations, people are not able to make choices for themselves. In the case of what they call living wills or advanced directives, adults writing ahead of time how they want different situations to be handled. If I'm incapacitated, don't keep me alive, just alleviate pain and let me die. Those sorts of directives, those can be set up. But when you're a child and you're just entering life, you're in a dependent situation, either on a parent or a legal guardian, a foster home. Somebody else has to be making the decisions while you learn how to make decisions. Popularity is not about learning how to make decisions. Popularity is about letting someone else make the decision for you. Frequently someone who has no stake in the consequences of that decision. If they make a wrong decision, like the doctors who decided for George Washington that one more bleeding should do the trick and make him better, they didn't have to live with the consequences of the fact that the choice was wrong. George Washington had to live with it, or in this case, had to die from it. This is where I would probably come down on the side of too much dialogue rather than too little. There are a whole list of things that growing up in a small Midwestern town, we simply weren't allowed to discuss at all. I grew up knowing I was different from the time I was 4, but not knowing what it was. Being gay was so not talked about in my town that I didn't know what a gay orientation was. I didn't know it was possible to be a healthy, well-adjusted gay person. I didn't know what the possibilities were. I figured that out when I was 26 and looked in the mirror and said, well, now it all makes sense. Why didn't somebody tell me? Well, they didn't tell me because the rules my particular local community had set up said we can't talk about certain things because it's just makes people uncomfortable, so we won't talk about it. Well, perhaps being a little bit uncomfortable is not a bad thing. Popularity is all about being comfortable, at least on the outside, about being able to smile all the time and look beautiful all the time, whether it's real or not. Somewhere early in life, I decided that what I wanted was something that was true, something that was real. As in early childhood, 5 and 6 years old, I was fascinated by stories. I read every story I could get my hands on. The Emperor's New Clothes, the fairy tales, the folk tales, any sort of Aesop's fables, all those sorts of stories. That's where a lot of my basic knowledge started coming from. When I did start reading the Bible, the first book I read, chapter every day for month after month after month, was the book of Proverbs. The wise sayings, and reaching for some kind of wisdom to know how to navigate the enormous complexity of the world around me. Because as someone with autism, I was always seeing so many details that it was very difficult to make sense of it. So I wanted to know the common principles, the wisdom that was underneath all of life, that created a sort of foundation to it. The timeless wisdom of folk tales from ancient India and ancient China, and anywhere I could find records of the stories that would be passed around. I recall reading one from China, for example, where the rulers kept trying to decide how to deal with a particular dragon, and nothing they did was effective. And so they finally asked the poor people of the town, what do you think? And the entire town came together and they brainstormed and they thought about it and they tossed ideas back and forth, and after a while finally came back to the rulers and said, this is what you should do. And it was a totally effective solution. When we try to say, I'm the smartest, or when we try to be the embodiment of the popular, instead of being the embodiment of our own unique creativity and ingenuity, we wind up with solutions that are never terribly perfect. One particular fairy tale, I don't even remember the name of it, but I remember reading it when I was 5 or 6, and I found it totally fascinating. It was a king who had 3 daughters, and he asked each one, how much do you love me? And the first daughter said, being a very intelligent young woman, obviously, but it was difficult for the king to see that at the time. She looked at him and said, "I love you as salt in my food." Well, that didn't sound terribly impressive, or pretty, or flowery, or popular. And so he asked his next daughter, "How much do you love me?" And she gave this romantic, flowery sort of, "I love you like the beauty of the sunset and the first flowers in spring," and all sorts of totally, things that were seen, but things upon which no one could act. They were simply beautiful metaphors. And the third daughter came and gave a similar answer. "I love you more than all the handsome young men in the entire kingdom, because you are my father after all, and I owe you my life," and so forth. Well, the story goes on, and it was kind of complicated about what happened to each of the sisters and the kingdom being overrun, and somewhere in the midst of all that, the oldest daughter's cunning was actually what created salvation, if you will, what actually saved the kingdom from being totally overrun. And so they were going to have a big feast, and now she was a hero. And as she's preparing this feast, knowing that her father, the king, is going to be there, she gives strict instructions to the chefs and the cooks in the kitchen that there is to be no salt used in any of the food, no salt whatsoever. She hadn't forgotten. And so the meal is served, and the king sits down, takes the first bite, and says, "Ugh," and finally understands for the first time what his daughter meant when she said, "I love you as salt in my food," that it was that particular kind of love that makes everything in life tolerable, that makes everything that nurtures life taste good and feel good and work, and that acts as a preservative. And the more the father began to understand just how essential salt was to the human diet in terms of food preservation, in terms of taste, in terms of all sorts of things, the more he really understood just how completely and how wisely his daughter's love for him was. And it wasn't about popularity, it was about wisdom. And wisdom is not always popular. In fact, many times it isn't, because wisdom challenges us to look at the things that are popular and critique them and find out whether they really work or whether they're just fluff, whether there's something substantial upon which you could build a healthy diet and build a house, or whether there's something like a straw hut on sand that will be knocked down by the first wave. Popularity only cares about appearance. It doesn't care about substance. It doesn't care about truth. It doesn't care about integrity. It doesn't care about whether this is something you will regret years from now, whether you will feel like you lost opportunities to develop yourself in all kinds of really incredible ways. I chose to take art classes in high school, not because it was popular, but because that's what was most in sync with my heart. And I still remember in the second year art class being told by the teacher, the first assignment we did at the beginning of the second year art class was to create a bust or a sculpture of our head, each student of his own head, out of oil-based clay. And the requirement was that we had to make a representation of our skulls before we would be allowed to put any flesh or hair or skin or anything on it, which in some ways seemed odd. And so we all had these caliper devices that would measure the width of things, and you'd hold it up to your own head and measure the width of your skull, and then measure the width of your sculpture that you're working on, and keep going back and forth to measure the dimensions of your head, and until it was reasonably certain that you had an oil-based clay sculptural representation of your own skull. And only when the teacher approved it at that point would you be allowed to add more clay to put on ears and lips and skin and eyeballs and hair and everything else. And the lesson the teacher came back to with that is, and I've found it true again so many times over the years, is that the underlying structure always determines the more superficial appearance. And so when I look at something and I wonder why it's shaped a particular way, I begin to look for what's underneath it, because that's what makes it the shape that it is. When somebody responds a certain way, what's underneath it? That's what makes it look the way it is. When somebody speaks or dances or any sort of expression, any sort of decision, any sort of movement, any sort of way of living, what we believe about ourselves, what's underneath, what's inner, always expresses itself through the appearances. If we only look at the appearances and we create this exterior shell, there will be nothing to support it. No strength, no substance, no durability, no reality. The pitfalls of popularity. I hope the thoughts I've shared in the last half hour have been helpful to you. Thank you very much for watching.